Alright guys, welcome back. In the last one we talked about tables. Today we're going to be talking about forms, HTML forms. Okay, now what is an HTML form? HTML forms are one of the main points of interaction between a user and a website. When a user clicks submit, the data is sent to the server for whatever reason the form was intended. A form consists of several widgets, alright? These widgets are just HTML elements that have interactive functionality, and they're like, these widgets are text fields, buttons, checkboxes, radio buttons, and these elements are paired with labels that describe the widget's purpose, what the widget is for. So that's the first slide. Pretty much we're going to be talking about. It requires the user to input some data. The form data is sent to the server when the user clicks submit. Forms consist of widgets. Widgets are basically HTML elements, and examples of form widgets are text fields, checkboxes, and radio buttons. Widgets are paired with labels to describe what the widget does. Alright, so let's get into some basic HTML form elements. So some of them are form, input, label, text area, and button, and we'll go through each one of these in this tutorial so you'll know how it all works together. Let's actually get into setting up a form. So here we have our basic HTML page set up with the main, and just gonna have this is our empty web page. Let's start with the form. So the form element has a double tag, and it has an action, and it also has a method. Okay, so the form element, like I said earlier, is a container element for everything that goes inside a form. Okay, all the widgets will be placed inside a form element. The container, this container, has special attributes like action and method, and they configure the way a form will behave when a user clicks submit. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about these action and method attributes. So the action specifies where the form is going to be sent. Alright, so suppose our HTML page is on some server. We're going to say that, when the user clicks submit, open up this link. Right? We'll just say form submit page. Now we don't need to get into the details of all this right now, so this is just an example. So this takes the form to another page of your website. Alright, so that's what this action is. The method, this defines what kind of HTTP method will be used to send the data. If this form was a search request and we're asking to get some data from the server, then you would be using something called a GET request, like this, But if this request was something like you want to add to a database or post something like on websites such as Facebook or Twitter, then we would be using a post request. So mostly in a form you'd be using an action, which is the location of where this data is going to be sent, and the method, which specifies what kind of HTTP request we're making. Are we looking to get some data, or are we looking to post some data, right? So now that we have just the basics of the container of form. The form is a container element, all right? So now let's talk a little bit about the different kinds of widgets that we can use in a form. So right now, if I save this, you'll see that nothing actually happens in here because the form is just a container element. We actually have to put widgets inside the form to so that the user can interact with it. So the main form of interaction is the input element. Okay, so this is the input element, and in most text editors, the default input method would be of type text. All right, so what this input does is what this element does is it offers a widget for user input. And let me show you what that is. So suppose I save this. You see this field. This is a type of widget. Now there are different types of HTML widgets. Mostly the stuff that you'd be using for text input would have a widget like this, like a box. So this is a normal text. There are different kinds of widgets depending on what input type you're specifying. For example, a date widget would have a calendar for you to select a date from. A color widget would probably have color swatches for you to select from, right? So this is a type called text. Let's talk about this type attribute. What exactly the input field should be is defined by this type attribute. And there are several types available like we just talked about. So let's say this text is for, let's say this widget is for the name. And we'll say this input will be for email. So you have the input tag, a type attribute set to email. Let's save this. And there you go. So this is for name and this is for email. Now there's a problem over here. As you can actually, let's do this. Let's put a break line between them so that they span in the next line. All right. So the first one we know is for name and the second one is for email. But as you can see, these input fields aren't clear. He doesn't know what he's supposed to enter in here. So you can label your widgets using the label element. All right. It provides the description for a widget. So let's have a look at that. Let's say label. And this has a for attribute, but we'll get to that in a bit. And we'll say this is for name. Okay? And when we save this, you see that, you see the label is placed before the input widget. So let's do the same thing for email. So we have a label and we'll have the second one for email. All right, save that. And there you go. Now you see there's a name and there's an email. So this is the reason we provide labels, because without labels, these widgets wouldn't be very intuitive to the user. He wouldn't know what he's supposed to fill, right? Now let's talk about a little bit about the for attribute. Now a label is linked to a widget by using this for attribute. All right. We know that this label is for this input. That's because we've written the code, but the computer doesn't actually know that. Now, why would it need to know? The same way, we know this email label is for this input, but the computer doesn't know that. The value of the for attribute should be the same as the widget's ID attribute. All right. So let's say I want to link this label to this input. If I set this input, I set the ID of this input to name and say that this label is for this ID is for an ID with a name of name, then it knows that this label is for this input. You get it? So to link a label to an input, the for attribute of the label should match the ID of the input. So let's set up an ID for the email as well. So I'll set up the ID for the email as email and the label as email. The same thing, right? So now save this. Right now there's visibly no change, but right now the name label is linked to the name input and the email label is linked to the email input. Now, why would we do this? There are two reasons. One is screen readers. Secondly, labels are clickable. So they allow you to activate a widget without exactly clicking on the input, but also by clicking on the name, also by clicking on the label. Why this is helpful is this offers a wider click area. This is especially useful when it comes to selecting tiny checkboxes or radio buttons. Let's work on our form a little bit more. Let's talk about something called the text area widget. You write text area. Now the text area, forget about all these attributes for a bit. Okay. So right now we have a text area, and you can see that the text area tag has both opening and closing tags, unlike the input widget, which is a self-closing tag. Let's set up a label for this. We'll call this label description. Now the difference between the text area and input type text elements is that text area is a multi-line field that can be expanded and has unlimited characters. You can see, you can expand the text area. But we cannot do that with the input field. Now, unlike the input tag, which is a self-closing tag, the other difference is the text area has both opening and closing tags. So here what you can do is you can also set up default values for the text area by simply writing some content between the two text area tags. So I'm just going to put some dummy text in, and if I save this, you'll see that, you know, text area has some default text in it. Now there are other ways you can actually set up default values for the input field, but that's using the value attribute. And here we can just put content directly between the opening and closing tags of the text area element. A couple of things that you need to know about the text area. You saw some attributes that I removed earlier. So that was name, ID, calls, and rows. Right? You know what ID is, so actually we can just say ID is description, and we'll say this label is for the description ID. Alright? Don't need to focus on this right now, but you can see that we have columns 30 and rows 10. So these are two attributes that you may require whenever you set up a text area element. So this sets the initial width and height of the text area. Okay, so if I save this now, you see that the text area pops up on the HTML page, which is 30 columns wide and 10 columns in height, 10 rows in height. This is the initial setup. Now we can, despite this, also expand the text area widget, which we cannot do with the input type text widget or the input type email widget. Okay. Another set of attributes that you can use is max length. Along with max length, there's min length. Okay, so what max length and min length do is that they set the maximum and minimum number of characters that the user will be allowed to input.